The girl went to the bus stop and disappeared. 2 days later, her body was found a few kilometers away. The police started an investigation, but they couldn't find any clues or evidence. The case remained unsolved for 38 years, and it was not until 2022 that innovative forensic technology finally helped to solve this dark mystery. In this video, we're going to talk about what happened to Mary Jane Thompson and how science is changing the way we solve these cases. Mary Jane Thompson was born on October 5, 1962 in Houston, Texas. She grew up in a friendly and loving family and had many friends. Back in high school, she decided she wanted to be a model. After studying, she moved to Los Angeles, where she lived for a while in pursuit of her dream. After that, she decided to move to Dallas to take acting classes. At that time, the girls were 21 years old. She had to take 2 jobs to pay her rent and tuition. Mary worked as a waitress and flower shop salesman, devoting the rest of her time to modeling. She lived in that busy rhythm for about 6 months. On February 11, 1984, Mary called her mother and said she was going to go to the hospital because I worried her some minor problem. The girl went there in the evening. She had to take the bus from her apartment to the clinic. When she arrived at the scene, the hospital was closed and she had to wait again for the bus to return. But no one had seen Mary since. The girl did not contact her relatives, but they were slow to raise the alarm. Mary combined 2 jobs with acting classes, so she often didn't have enough time to call her parents. 2 days later, the Dallas Police Department received a call. Someone's body was found outside the abandoned train tracks behind the warehouse. The detectives who arrived at the scene saw a young girl with signs of strangulation. No documents were found, so the victim was quickly identified. It was Mary Jane Thompson. In those years, the area was mostly occupied by warehouses, most of which were empty. For this reason, Mary was not seen until 2 days later. Experts also found that the cause of her death was strangulation, and the unsub used her own leg warmers. He also abused Mary, which enabled forensics to extract his biological material. In 1984, however, this evidence was completely useless, as they could not even extract a sample of the killer's DNA, let alone identify him. But even in those years, the police had to store such samples in a laboratory, as law enforcement officials hoped that with the development of technology, they would be able to solve such cases sooner or later. After examining Mary's murder scene, the investigators found no evidence. The warehouse behind which her body was found was about 5 kilometers from the hospital in a remote industrial area. After talking to her friends and relatives, they were able to build a more accurate timeline. Seeing the clinic closed, Mary had to walk some distance to the bus stop to go home. The perpetrator apparently attacked her there, after which he loaded the girl into the car and drove her to the place where her body was found. In the absence of any evidence, investigators began to look at men who had previously been convicted and who had lived and worked in the field. But this line of investigation did not yield any result. The police were sure that the killer knew the area well. Not only was he able to kidnap a girl in a place where it went completely unnoticed, but I also took her to the abandoned railroad tracks, which were covered by warehouses. The investigators also had no witnesses who could have seen Mary Jane at least briefly that night. There were no surveillance cameras in those years, except for the most significant streets of the city. This case quickly came to a standstill. He was handed over to the Unsolved Homicide Unit, which was to resume such investigations periodically. It wasn't until 25 years later, in 2009. The Dallas Police Department decided to reinvestigate the murder using new technology. Forensics were able to extract a DNA sample from the biological material found on Mary Jane's body. But their luck ended there. The sample was run through all available databases, but its owner was not there. This may indicate that he has never been prosecuted for serious crimes before, or had a record in the years before DNA had been taken from criminals like that. As a result, the detectives were left with only one thing to do: periodically running this sample through the database with the expectation that its owner would fall for some other crime. Such cases occur quite often. Therefore, investigators solve even the most hopeless cases The case was reopened 9 years later, in 2018. The detective then sought help from an independent organization that focused on solving violent crimes and developed various tools and measures in an effort to reduce the number of such cases. Along with the detectives, they were trying to get Mary Jane to have more resources committed to the latest DNA research, and it was only 2 years later, in 2020, that the FBI joined the investigation. At that time, the Bureau had already collected a huge number of old unsolved cases in which investigators had a DNA sample of the criminal, but they never managed to identify the suspect. With the development of technology, all of these murders have a solid chance of being solved thanks to genetic genealogy. This technology, which appeared relatively recently, has become a real breakthrough in forensic science. It works in about the following way. Specialists are studying the DNA sample of an unknown person using the latest equipment. On the basis of the data obtained, a profile is formed by which relatives can be found. Family members' DNA can get into databases in several ways. First, they themselves can be criminals and get into the FBI database. Second, these people may voluntarily enter their DNA into publicly accessible databases designed to search for relatives or establish their ancestry. Such services have become particularly popular in recent years, which has only benefited detectives. In the case of Mary Jane's murder, the search took 2 years. First, forensics found his distant cousins on a DNA sample, and then the tricky part began. They had to study the biographies of several thousand people, weed out all the unsuitable, and choose the most likely killer. Screening occurs on such grounds as age, place of residence at the time of the murder, and so on. Complicating matters is that DNA databases only point to a specific group of relatives, but there are no donor samples to compare. There is only one way out. Choose the most suitable candidate and get his DNA. In 2022, detectives were given the name of a man who may have killed Mary Jane. They examined his background and decided to follow him. After waiting for the right moment, the police obtained an item from which to take a DNA sample. The lab ran the necessary tests and concluded that his DNA was a perfect match for Mary's killer. This man was 60-year-old Edward Morgan from Dallas. As the police suspected, he lived near the scene of the murder, only 1 kilometer away. At that time, he was only 22 years old. In February, Morgan was arrested and charged with murder. He is currently in custody awaiting trial. Bail is set at $500,000. The police have yet to disclose any details of this man's life, which will be known only during the trial. But one thing is certain: the biological material found on the victim's body is a perfect match for his DNA. During the press conference, investigators expressed confidence that Morgan would be found guilty and punished. He faces the death penalty for what he did in Texas. Unfortunately, Mary Jane's parents did not live to see it. Her father, who tried to get justice for his daughter, died in 2020, and her mother before that. Of the next of kin, she had only one sister who was shocked by the police call. 38 years later, a detective told her they finally knew the killer's name and he was arrested. In her social network, my sister was constantly writing about Mary Jane, congratulating her on her birthday and telling her that she would never stop hoping that the case would be solved. Upon learning of Edward Morgan's arrest, the woman wished him to spend the rest of his life behind bars. She also promised to go to every trial until the final point was reached. In this way, genetic genealogy offers detectives unprecedented opportunities. Prior to the invention of this branch, the police had to search for criminals with evidence or witnesses. The presence of a DNA sample never guaranteed that he'd be able to find the killer, but now experts on the smallest sample are able to find even the most distant relatives and ultimately determine the identity of the holder. The only thing preventing us from solving every single one of these cases is the limitations of our DNA. Although, according to one person, experts can identify several thousand of his relatives, this is still not enough. But science is moving, and in the foreseeable future, we can see technologies that, based on a single DNA sample, can easily identify anyone. Already now experts can create an approximate portrait of the holder of DNA, and this direction is only at the beginning of its development. Share your opinion on this story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to help promote this video. Thanks for watching it. The student got off the bus and disappeared without a trace. The next day, her body was found in a field. Police spent 39 years searching for the culprit, and it was only in 2019 that modern technology allowed us to discover the truth. In this video, we will tell you what happened to Helene Prosinski. Helene Prosinski was born on 6 April 1958 in Huntington, New York City. She was the youngest of 3 children. Her brother and sister were 12 and 9 years old respectively. The girl grew up loving and caring. She got along well with her older relatives and was a positive light person. When she was 14 years old, her father was offered a job. The family had to move to a small town, Hamilton, near Boston. There she enrolled in a local school where she became interested in singing and sports. At the same time, Helene decided that she wanted to associate her future life with journalism. After high school, she enrolled at Wheaton College, 110 kilometers from her town. It was close enough to visit his family regularly. In addition, this school offered a really high-quality education in the field of journalism. Helene quickly adapted to student life. She studied perfectly and took an active part in college life. Eventually, she had an opportunity she was looking forward to. She was to go to practice at the radio station's news department in Denver. Despite being more than 3,000 kilometers from her college, Helene was delighted with the opportunity. In addition, her uncle and aunt lived in Denver and agreed to adopt the girl while practicing. With the same went a classmate who studied at the journalism faculty. In January 1980, Helene, who was 21 years old at the time, flew to Denver and began work at a radio station. Every day she had to take a bus from her office to her home. The road took about 30 minutes, after which she had to walk for several kilometers. On January 16, she left the station at 6 p.m. and went to the bus stop. Her aunt immediately began to worry. As before, Helene always warned her if she planned to stay somewhere. The woman waited a few hours, but at 10:30 p.m. she decided to go to the police. The investigators immediately began their search, fearing that her disappearance might be linked to the recent series of attacks on women in the area. They searched the area along the Helene route all night, but could not find her. In the morning, a woman contacted the police. She was driving her car in a suburban area of Denver with her children. At some point, they noticed that someone was lying in a field near the road. The mother stopped the car, came closer, and saw the body of the young girl without signs of life. The police officers who arrived at the scene immediately identified Helene. Her clothes were partially missing. Her hands were tied behind her back. All her personal belongings were also missing. Later, medical experts determined that the girls had given 9 stab wounds as well as violence. Death occurred between 8 and 10 o'clock in the evening. The police were able to find a witness who saw Helene get off the bus around 5:30. She had to walk for several kilometers from the stop, and apparently the perpetrator attacked her on this particular stretch of road. Law enforcement agencies searched the area near where the body was found, but they couldn't find a single clue except for shoe impressions, supposedly size 44, that led from the road to the body and back. By that time, medical experts had found biological material on the victim's body and clothing, apparently belonging to the killer. But in those years, it could not help the investigation because the science in the field of DNA was only at an early stage of development. But these samples were sent to the lab for safekeeping, hoping that in the future they could help identify the perpetrator. The police sought information from the public through newspapers and local television. They were trying to find witnesses who might have seen Helene that night. They were soon approached by a woman who saw a man near the field where the body was found around 10:20 p.m. He was standing on the side of the road beside the car. Unfortunately, it was dark and the woman could not see the man in detail. She gave the police only general features that could not help them. Then the detectives took a very interesting step. With the consent of the witness, they brought in a hypnotist, and the woman was able to recall more of the details on which it was possible to draw a portrait of this unknown man. It is difficult to say whether the hypnosis session really helped the investigation, but the fact remains. At that time, the police had nothing but this drawing. However, they never managed to find any suspects, and this case was frozen for years. 6 months later, Helene posthumously received her college diploma in memory. In addition, the school's management has established an alumni award named after her. This award was given for active participation in college life, which was inherent to Helene throughout her studies. The investigation was only resumed in 1998, 18 years after the murder. By that time, DNA technology had progressed significantly. The researchers entered samples of biological material into the FBI database. Unfortunately, no matches were found. This meant that the perpetrator had not previously been prosecuted, at least not since the convicts didn't start taking DNA. 15 years later, in 2013, a unit was established at the local police headquarters to deal with unsolved cases. They reopened the investigation into Helene's murder, but no new leads could be found. The DNA sample from the victim's body never entered the FBI database. This meant that the girl's killer was never seen by the police for other possible crimes. During all these years, not only the police and Helene's relatives have tried to find the truth. The girl's high school friends, with whom she was in the choir, took an active part in the investigation. Decades after her murder, they kept pushing detectives to review the case regularly. They also gave interviews to bring the story to the public and distributed leaflets with information about Helene's murder along her bus route. In 2017, the case was reopened again. And this time, the detectives had much more opportunities. At this point, forensic science began to make extensive use of genetic genealogy, by which the identity of the criminal could be identified through his relative. Of course, it was a very complex and protracted process. Moreover, this method only worked if the DNA-bearing relatives were in publicly available genetic databases. There are several of these, and they are mainly used to search for family members. In 2018, police handed over available DNA samples to Parabon's lab, which has already solved hundreds of such cases. The expert had to examine about 3,000 matches, including even the most distant relatives of the alleged killer. It was then necessary to screen out those who were not of age or who could not commit the crime for other reasons. In the end, the experts determined that the holder of the DNA was likely the son of a woman named June Estes, who was no longer alive. The problem was that she had 4 sons, but the lab was able to identify only 2 of them. They were 10 and 11 years old at the time of the murder, so they were expelled. The search for the other 2 sons dragged on, and the experts began to explore other options. Another year passed, when suddenly something unexpected happened. Some woman named Jessie had her DNA swabbed into the public database, which was the primary tool for tracking criminals. Experts from Parabono immediately saw that Jessie is a close enough relative of the killer Helene and connected with her. In more detailed DNA analysis, forensics determined the killer was Jessie's second cousin. The detectives asked the woman to provide information about her family to finally identify the suspect. And luckily, Jessie was into podcasts about various crimes, like the Helene murder. It is for this reason that she has put her data in an open database, because with the help of genetic genealogy, you can find a person even through the most distant relatives, and Jessie knew that her decision could help solve some case. However, she could not imagine that this would happen immediately after uploading her data into the database. The woman began to collect information about her ancestry and also asked both parents to enter their DNA into the database. That's how Parabon's experts established that the killer was connected to Jessie on his father's side. Unfortunately, the search for an answer took several months. Forensics, detectives, and Jessie's family worked together to get close to the guy who had the DNA from the murder, and soon it finally happened. The policeman managed to get to a relative of June Estes, and he told new details about her older sons. It turned out that the woman was suffering from mental problems, and after her next breakdown, the father took the boys to another city. Their names were William and Curtis, and the detectives had to find out which of them was the killer. The answer was not long in coming. The police immediately discovered that William had been repeatedly imprisoned. His DNA was entered into the FBI database in 2010. Given that the sample from Helene's body has since been run repeatedly through this database, William was not the killer. The downside of this database is that it only shows a full match, not a partial one, even if it involves brothers. As a result, 39 years after the murder, the police had a prime suspect, Curtis White. Turns out, this man has a history of crime. At 18, he knocked on a woman's door and asked to use her phone. Once inside the house, he pulled out a knife and abused the victim, after which he escaped. He was quickly caught and imprisoned for 30 years. Only he got out 4 years later. He was released early because an employee of the Christian teen care facility where Curtis had been to his majority had intervened for the theft of a car. The man stated that he was willing to take the criminal home and find him a job. It's hard to imagine bringing a convicted felon to your home with your wife and 5 kids, but this man asked the court to release Curtis on exactly these terms. When he got out, Curtis moved in with him and worked with a gardener. At the time of Helene's murder, he was living in the area. He later moved to Florida, where the detectives went in 2019. Curtis was then 62 years old. He worked as a trucker. Before they could charge him with Helene's murder, the investigators wanted more evidence. They'd been watching the man for about a week, trying to get a secret sample of his DNA. First, they removed a carton of milk from his dumpster and sent it to the lab. Forensics found someone's DNA on it, but it was too small for analysis. On November 30, detectives followed him to a bar where the suspect had drunk several beers from a single glass. As soon as he left, this glass was seized and sent to a lab in Colorado. Transportation and study took almost a month, but eventually the detectives had the long-awaited results on their hands. The sample from the victim's body was a complete match to Curtis's DNA. He was arrested on 11 December and charged with the murder of Helene. The man denied any involvement, so the prosecutor was preparing to take the case to court, and the man was extradited to Colorado, and something unexpected happened. On the way there, he began to confess what he had done. The detectives who accompanied him listened to every detail of the crime. Curtis said he was driving down the street and saw a lonely girl get off the bus. After he took the knife, he forced her to get into his car to commit violent acts. After that, he drove her outside the city, abused her, and killed her. As a result, he was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Given that he will be 82 years old by then, the perpetrator may well not live to see that day. Unfortunately, most relatives of Helene herself did not wait for the moment when the killer will be punished. Her parents and older brother had died many years earlier, and only her older sister remained alive. Almost 40 years later, an elderly woman received a call from the police station where she was finally informed that the case had been solved. There's one more terrible thing about this story. As you may recall, at the time of Helene's murder, there were repeated cases of abuse of women in Denver. These crimes had a common MO. Now the detectives think Curtis was behind them, but cannot prove it. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe to help promote this clip. Good luck and bye. For many years, the story to be told in this video has stirred up Europe. It is full of many mysteries. It seemed that these mysteries would never be revealed, but suddenly something shocking happened to everyone. Something that revealed the mysteries of this story. The story begins with a pair of Angelique and Ed van den Herk. The couple met in 1978. By this time, Ed was married once and had a 2-year-old son. Little is known about Angelica's past. As for Ed, he was a popular singer in the Netherlands. By 1980, the relationship between Ed and Angelica came to the wedding. In the same year, the couple had a girl named Nico. A year later, Angelica told Ed that he was not the biological father of the girl. However, despite this, Ed adopted Nicole. In 1988, Ed and Angelica's relationship broke down. The woman had mental health problems. Ed, even though he was not the daughter's father, insisted in court that custody of Nicole be given to him after the divorce. As a result, the court took his side, and after the divorce, Nicole lived with her stepfather and half-brother. Of course, she often saw her mother, but unfortunately her mother's mental illness was only progressing. In 1995, Ed married his third wife, Iolanta. His ex-wife and mother Nicole, Angelica, could not accept this fact and eventually committed suicide. Of course, it was a shock to Nicole. During this difficult time, she was particularly supported by her half-brother, Andy. From that moment on, a key part of the story begins. In 1995, Nicole was already 15 years old. She was at school and worked in one of the bakeries of Conmar's store. October 6, 1995 seemed like a normal day. After school, Nicole went to her grandmother's house as usual to prepare for work. She took her keys, her purse, and she rode her bike to the bakery. In the eyes of her employer, she was a responsible girl. She was never late for work, but this day was far from ordinary. It was 15 minutes into her shift, and Nicole was still missing. The owner of the bakery called Nicole's house, but they were sure she was already at work. Of course, it caused a lot of anxiety, and Nicole's stepfather called the police. The police interviewed possible witnesses, but unfortunately, no one saw a girl that looked like Nicole that day. Then, about an hour later, something was found. During the search, the police found Nicole's bike rather quickly. It was abandoned on the bank of the river. Such a finding obviously did not inspire optimism. There were no other traces of the girl anywhere. Near the place where the bike was found, the work of divers was organized. They tried to find it in the dark, cloudy waters of the river, but luckily she wasn't there. The police were at a loss. It was as if there was no trace of this girl, and no one had any idea where to look for her. In the hope of finding any leads, the detectives questioned the missing girl's family and friends, so they were able to find out that Nicole's biological father lives in Germany, and recently the girl's mother died. This information slightly weakened the police's grasp, because it was suggested that Nicole had run away from home to reunite with her biological father. However, the biological father of the girl denied this assumption. Over the next 2 weeks, the search for the girl yielded no results. Nicole's stepfather criticized the police for not doing enough to find the missing girl. In desperation, he even turned to a psychic. He said that the search should be carried out along the coast of the river where the girl's bike was found. Then, on October 13, 13 days after Nicole's disappearance, the police received another solid piece of evidence. Nicole's bag was found on the riverbank that day. This was a new lead. Nothing was missing from the bag, which made the situation even stranger. After searching the bottom of the river again, the police finally ruled out the possibility that Nicole had drowned. Over the next 5 weeks, the story of Nicole's disappearance is broadcast on several major channels. The leading newspaper, Eindhoven's Dagblad, appears on the front page several times. But all this does not bring results. Then, on 22 November, on the 47th day of the search for the girl, the main question in the case was answered. On November 22, 1995, 10 kilometers from Nicole's house, a tourist discovered human remains in the woods. Forensics confirmed they belonged to Nicole van den Heers. There were several serious wounds to her head. Her lower jaw was broken, and she was stabbed in the chest. Experts considered that the cause of death was internal bleeding. Now, one important question, where Nicole disappeared, replaced another, no less important, who was responsible for her death. But even here, the police had little to go on. It was not until 8 February 1996, 10 weeks after the girl's body was found, that the police had a trace. On that day, a woman arrested in the United States for drug trafficking reported knowing who was responsible for Nicole's death. She said a name that was familiar to the victim's stepfather. The woman said that Nicole, like herself, was involved in drug trafficking, which allegedly caused her death, but the police couldn't confirm it. And it was believed that the woman came up with this story in order to be extradited from the United States to the Netherlands. Eventually, the police came to the conclusion that Nicole's stepfather and brother had been arrested. But after 4 days in custody, they were released because the police had no specific evidence against them. Week after week, month after month, the case does not move from deadlock, and soon it falls on the archives of the police. It remained there for 9 years and was reopened in 2005, but briefly, as no new evidence was found again. So, Nicole's case was archived a second time until something shocking happened. On March 8, 2011, long after the girl's death, her brother Andy posted on Facebook, "Today, I will be arrested for the murder of Nicole. I confessed I'll be in touch soon." The crowd was overwhelmed by the message. For 16 long years, the perp has been under the nose of the police, but in all this time, no one has been able to tie a seemingly close man to the death of a girl. By the time Andy revealed his secret to the world, he was living in England. The same day he was arrested, he spent another 3 weeks in England and was transferred to the Netherlands. The local police were already there, and they reopened an investigation into a case that seemed never to be solved. Andy, the brother of the murdered Nicole, was taken to the Netherlands on 30 March 2011. But despite his confession online, the man, for some reason, stopped contacting the police on the case. He was unable to describe the circumstances in which the crime was committed or explain the motive clearly. In many parts of the world, voluntary recognition is not a reason to condemn a person. If there is no evidence other than a confession against the defendant, such a person cannot be convicted. This legislation is also in force in the Netherlands. Finally, on April 5, despite his confession, Andy was released, but he still wouldn't stop, as if he had some stone on his soul he needed to get rid of. Perhaps his next confession was an attempt to drop this very stone. Right on the day of his release, Andy revealed who Nicole's real killer was. It was their father, Ed. The guy admitted that his dad did it to cover up one big secret. According to Andy, after Nicole's mother died, the girl's stepfather raped her. Somehow, Ed managed to convince Nicole not to tell anyone about it, but the problem was that as a result of the rape, the girl became pregnant. The man feared that if a 15-year-old girl had a child, it would reveal the truth about his crime, so he killed the girl. Of course, the victim's stepfather himself denied that this was the case. However, it was obvious that it would be strange to hear such accusations from the son against the father. If they had no foundation, in an attempt to establish the truth, the police decided to dig up the body of the buried Nicolas in order to send it to an in-depth medical examination. No one at the time could have guessed how this case would end. Examination showed that Nicole's body had the DNA of 2 people's semen. One of the 2 men was her boyfriend, which is basically not strange, while the other person was unknown. What was clear was that neither her brother Andy nor her stepfather was that person. This unsub was probably Nicole's killer. However, this begs the question, what was the meaning of the confessions of the murdered brother? Why did he first confess to the murder of Nicolas himself and then accuse his father of it? By giving an interview, the guy himself answered this question. Andy thought his sister's case needed to be reviewed because in the 16 years since her death, technology has moved forward, and what seemed useless in 1995 now, by looking at the body again, could help establish the truth. Through his confessions, he tried to get the police to reopen the case, examine Nicole's body, or try to find new leads. For this, he even had to perjure his father. The guy knew that his father was innocent, so he understood that it did not threaten him with anything serious. However, this left the police no choice, and authorities had to send Nicole's body back for further examination, and his victims were not in vain. After all, in 2012, the police were able to identify the man whose semen was found in Nicole's body. This man was a man named Jos de Guy. At the time of Nicole's death, he was 28 years old. By 2012, he had already been tried several times. Once for beating up his girlfriend. The second time was for raping a single girl riding a bike, which was a lot like Nicole. In addition, he spent 5 years in a mental health clinic. Now he became the main suspect in the rape and murder of Nicole van den Hurk. The trial of the then 48-year-old man began in 2015. His lawyer insisted that the semen evidence only proved that the defendant had sex with Nicole. That doesn't prove rape, let alone murder. A more detailed examination revealed that, in addition to the semen, other traces of the defendant's DNA were found on the victim's body and clothing. The prosecutor asked for 16 years in prison, followed by treatment in a mental health clinic, but the court found Jos Digi not guilty of Nicole's death and sentenced him to only 5 years for rape, which caused outrage in the room.
Alles overwegend legt de rechtbank aan verdachte een gevangenisstraf op voor de duur van 5 jaar. Met aftrek van de tijd die verdachte...
Goed gedaan, jongens. Goed gedaan. Echt waar. Ik ben trots op mij. Kijk vanavond naar mijn kinderen. Kijk, applaus, nog één keer. Super.
The family of the murdered Nicole was crushed by the sentence. Many considered it too lenient, but in 2018, the prosecutor managed to have the case reviewed. This time, the accused was found guilty not only of rape, but also of the death of Nicholas, and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. All this was possible because Nicole's brother did not accept her death. It would seem that 16 years had passed, but he still remembered and had the courage to do a truly amazing thing. On December 16, 2004, a horrible murder was committed in the town of Skidmore. The FBI was already involved in the investigation from the first minutes. In the history of the USA, there were no analogues to this crime, so on the first day, all TV channels of the country talked about this case. But as strange as that sounds, in this case, it's not suicide anymore, it's what it was for, and in particular, what the killer stole from his victim. Bobby Joe Stinnett and his husband had known each other since childhood. They both grew up in the small town of Skidmore, Missouri, which has a population of about 300. The boy and the girl lived next door and had been spending a lot of time together since they were young. They had always been very close, and 3 years after graduating from high school, they married and moved in together. Zeb worked in a local factory. As for Bobby Joe, she was a dog farmer. In this case, she had one of the most important rules. Before she sold a puppy to someone, she had to meet the person and make sure that the puppy fell into good hands. She often attended various dog shows and spent a lot of time on specialized dog forums, where she sometimes found new hosts for her puppies. Love for animals was not Bobby Joe's only passion, and he also loved children. Ever since high school, she used to babysit, stay with the neighborhood kids, so it's no surprise that when she found out she was pregnant in April 2004, she was over the moon. The young couple was getting ready to join the family, and by Christmas, they both looked forward to the same gift, the appearance of their firstborn. On the morning of December 16, 2004, Zeb left for work as usual. Bobby Joe was already 9 months pregnant. The girl planned to spend the whole day at home. The day before, she had arranged to meet a woman who wanted to buy a rat terrier puppy. Bobby Joe had known a customer a long time. Her name was Darlene Fisher. They met at one of the dog forums and had been talking online for over 6 months. Darlene lived in a nearby town called Fairfax, about 30 kilometers from the Stinnett family home. Regular Bobby Joe was meeting buyers at her house. At about 2:30 p.m., Bobby Joe's mother, Becky Harper, called her daughter. Becky's car broke down, and she asked her daughter to take her to the auto shop. Bobby Joe couldn't have done it right now because Darlene Fisher was gonna be there any minute. So she told her mother she would pick her up in an hour. At some point, the doorbell rang. Bobby Joe said it was probably Darlene, then hung up. An hour later, at 3:30 p.m., Becky Harper walked out onto her front porch and was surprised that her daughter had not yet come to pick her up. She tried to contact her daughter, but her calls remained unanswered. Bobby Joe's house was about 1 kilometer from her mother's house, and after unsuccessful phone calls, Becky decided to go to her daughter herself and find out why she wasn't answering her phone. The woman entered the house in shock. She saw her daughter lying on the floor in a pool of blood. It is impossible to put into words the feelings of parents in this situation. In the hope of saving her daughter, the woman immediately called 911. Police and an ambulance arrived at the scene, but despite the prayers of the mother, as well as the efforts of the paramedics, the girl was never rescued. During the examination of the crime scene, it was established that the assailant stole something from his victim, namely her child. As soon as the paramedics noticed, the assailant removed the baby from the abdomen of the victim's 9th month of pregnancy. The medical examiner found that the perpetrator attacked from behind. He put a rope around Bobby Joe's neck and strangled her. At some point, the girl passed out. Probably the perpetrator thought she was already dead. The attackers then pulled out a knife and began to cut the baby out of the stomach of their victim. At that moment, the girl regained consciousness. The criminal again put a rope around her neck and this time completed his work. Such a crime shocked the entire Skidmore. Almost everyone here knew each other and nobody could believe that this could happen in their little town. The victim's neighbors told the police that they had seen a red car outside her home the previous day. Bobby Joe's mother also informed the police that her daughter was supposed to meet a woman named Darlene Fisher from nearby Fairfax. But the investigation revealed that a man named Fairfax simply did not exist. The main hope was for cyber experts working with the victim's computer. They did manage to find Bobby Joe's correspondence with Darlene Fisher. After that, the experts identified the Esper, the alleged killer, who provided invaluable information for the investigation. As it turned out, Darlene Fisher used the internet dial-up. This is a type of internet connection using a city phone line. This already enabled the police to identify the telephone number of the owner of the house from which the internet connection was made. The phone number was registered to a man named Kevin Montgomery. He lived in Melvin, Kansas, more than 200 kilometers from where the crime was committed. The day after the murder, the police and the FBI were outside his house. They were absolutely not surprised to see a red Toyota in the yard. Kevin graciously invited the officers to the house. After going inside, the police saw Kevin's wife, 36-year-old Lisa Montgomery. The woman was sitting on the sofa in front of the TV and holding a newborn baby. Lisa explained to the police that yesterday she went shopping in Topeka, 60 kilometers from her husband's house. During the trip, she went into labor, which she told Kevin on the phone. She was taken to a women's clinic where she gave birth to the same girl she was holding. On the same day, Lisa and her daughter were discharged from the clinic because both she and the girl were perfectly healthy. Kevin went to Topeka, where he picked up Lisa and her daughter from a parking lot at one of the malls. They then went home to Melvin. It was obvious to the police that this was a very strange story, but at the moment the main task was to make the arrest so that the child did not suffer. One of the agents asked Lisa, "Mom, you can give the baby to my colleague and come with me to another room for a private conversation." That's what Lisa said. Yes, of course. She gave the child to a police officer. Kevin or Lisa were arrested at the same time. The police have requested the same clinic Lisa was talking about. They were told that no woman named Lisa Montgomery had ever been admitted to the clinic. The woman then changed her testimony and said that she had actually given birth at home, but she couldn't prove it. Even her husband, Kevin, couldn't prove it. And only now, realizing that she had already lost her husband's support, did Lisa admit to killing Bobby Joe. And this baby that she supposedly gave birth to was actually carved out of Bobby Joe's stinette stomach. Kevin Montgomery had absolutely nothing to do with it. For the past 8 months, he'd been convinced that his wife was indeed pregnant. After Lisa's arrest, the girl was handed over to her father. The baby was completely healthy. He was unharmed, except for a small cut near his left eye. The girl was named Victoria Joe, just like her mother wanted. As for Lisa, the police began to investigate her past in order to understand what prompted the woman to do such a terrible thing. Lisa Montgomery was born in February 1968 in Fort Lewis, Washington. Her father, Edgar, was in the army and in South Korea at the time. As for her mother, Judy, she was a housewife. Edgar and Judy's marriage did not last long, and when Lisa was only 3 years old, her mother filed for divorce. Sometime after this, Judy began dating a man who was considerably older than her. He used to drink too much, which often made him aggressive. He's been sexually abusing Lisa for years. One night, when Lisa was 15, Judy caught her husband's daughter together. According to Lisa, the man then left their family and the mother accused the girl of seducing her husband and that it was because of her that he left. But Judy herself denied it. At this point, Lisa's mother had 5 children. Lisa was the eldest. After a while, Judy began dating a local sheriff, Richard Bowman. Richard and Judy soon married. The man had a son from his first marriage, Carl, who was 23 years old at the time. Lisa met him when she was 16, and even though they were half brothers and half sisters, a few months after they met, they started dating. When Lisa turned 18, she and Carl moved in together. After a while, Lisa became pregnant and they married. In January 1987, Lisa had her first child with Carl. Over the next 3 years, Lisa gave birth to 3 more children. The children described her as a cold woman who always kept a distance with them. In 1990, Lisa underwent a sterilization operation. According to her husband, it was a joint decision. However, according to Lisa herself, she did not want this, but her mother and husband forced her to take this step. A year after that, Carl and Lisa's marriage broke up, and as a result of the trial, the girl received full custody of their 4 children. In 1995, Lisa and Carl resumed their relationship and remarried. However, Lisa cheated on him, and they developed again in 1997. This time, the court divided custody of the children. 2 adult children moved in with their father, and 2 younger children stayed with Lisa. In 1999, while working at a factory in Topeka, Lisa met Kevin Montgomery. The same year they married. Lisa's ex-husband, Carl, also married around the same time period, a woman named Vanessa. Carl did not think Lisa was a good mother, so he went to court in early 2004 in order to get custody not only of their 2 oldest children, but also of the children who lived with Lisa. Lisa had to retaliate. She felt that if she got pregnant now, she would look more favorable to the court. In April 2004, she began telling everyone that she and Kevin were expecting a baby. She started wearing baggy things that covered up her stomach. This spectacle affected everyone except her ex-husband Carl, who knew she could no longer have children. On December 10, 2004, Carl and his lawyer filed a motion accusing Lisa of lying and attempting to manipulate the court. Lisa didn't want to look like a liar in court, so she decided to do something radical. As a consequence, on December 16, 2004, Lisa strangled Bobby Jo Stinnett. She then cut her baby out of her mother's womb. The police also found out that Lisa and Bobby Jo had been dating before the murder. It was the first time that they had met. They met in April 2004 when Bobby Jo was already pregnant. Lisa's younger daughter was very interested in breeding dogs and liked to attend dog shows. She went to one with her mother, where Lisa met Bobby Jo. After this meeting, Lisa communicated with the girl online on both her own behalf and that of the fictional Darlene Fisher. So when Bobby Jo saw Lisa instead of Darlene on her doorstep, she didn't feel any danger because she knew this woman. The trial of Lisa Montgomery took place in October 2007. Her husband, Kevin Montgomery, was never charged with any crime because he was really unaware of his wife's crime. But even though his wife did such a terrible thing, Kevin stood by her in court until the end. As a result of the trial, Lisa Montgomery was sentenced to death on 8 December 2020. As for the rescued girl, Victoria Jo, there is virtually no public record of her because her family skillfully hid her from the press. The only thing that can be said for sure is that every December 16, Victoria meets simultaneously with a smile and with sadness, because every new birthday she has is also every new anniversary of her mother's death.
This case has finally come to a close, but we will never stop missing Bobby Jo. She was a sweet and loving wife, daughter, and sister, and would have been a wonderful mother.
The story that this video is about has shaken America. It was so shocking that 6 months later, it was one of the best TV series of 1991. Well, one of its members still runs its YouTube channel. Not tired of answering questions related to what happened, the story begins in Garden Grove, California, with a man named David Brown. By 1985, David had succeeded as a successful businessman. His business involved recovering data from damaged computer media and bringing him a very good income. But the man didn't stop there. He wanted to live a more and more rich life. So I tried my best to develop my already successful project. As for David's private life, by the time he was 32, he had a large house in which, in addition to himself, lived his young 23-year-old wife Linda. Their 8-month-old daughter, Crystal, Linda's 17-year-old sister, Patty Belly, aged, and David's older daughter from a previous marriage. Linda and Patty grew up in a large family, and their father left them early, so the girl spent her entire childhood with her mother, who had 8 other children besides Linda and Patty. David lived next door to them. He was very busy with his work, and he just had no time to do household chores. As a result, he offered to pay Linda's mother to send one of her daughters to him several times a week to do chores at David's house. Linda's mother agreed, and twice a week sent her eldest daughter Linda to David's house to cook and clean. Despite the age difference, at the age of 9, David and Linda began a relationship, and at the age of 17, they married. However, their marriage lasted only a couple of months, after which they divorced. Shortly after, David married again, and it was his 5th marriage, but he was also very short, and eventually David and Linda got back together and got married a second time. This time their marriage was much stronger than the previous one, and 5 years later they had a daughter, Crystal. On March 19, 1985, police were called to the Brown family home. On the ground floor of the house, police found David, his 8-month-old daughter, as well as a frightened Patty, the younger sister of David's wife. The body of 23-year-old Linda Brown, David's wife, was found in the bedroom on the 2nd floor of the house and died of 2 gunshots. David told me that he and Linda had a little fight this evening, which led to him leaving the house to have a little fun in his car. He went to the beach where he just sat and thought about his life. He wasn't home for about an hour. When he returned, he found Patty holding his 8-month-old Crystal. The girl was very frightened as David's eldest daughter, Cinnamon, who lived with them, threatened her with a gun and even fired several shots in her direction, which was confirmed by 3 bullet holes in the wall. David explained to the police that Cinnamon was a very troubled child and that she had become even more uncontrollable. With the onset of puberty, she was constantly arguing with her stepmother Linda, which eventually led to Linda insisting that Cinnamon sleep in a trailer on the front lawn. At the moment, he had no idea where his 14-year-old daughter was. According to him, he himself was very afraid of what had happened, so he didn't even go into his wife's bedroom and called the police immediately. The police searched the vicinity of the house for Cinnamon and found the girl. They found her in a doghouse in the backyard of the house. It was a very unpleasant sight. The 14-year-old girl was lying unconscious in her own urine and vomit, and in her hands was a suicide note that was written, "God forgive me, I didn't mean to hurt her." The girl was taken away by the medics. On the way to the hospital, she regained consciousness, saying that she had taken more than 50 different pills in an attempt to die. She spent several days in hospital before being taken to the police station, as she was the main suspect in the murder of her stepmother, Linda Brown. During the interrogation, the girl did not deny her guilt and confessed fully to the murder. She said that she did it because Linda didn't love her and tried to get out of the house, constantly complaining about her to David, Father Cinnamon. According to her, the girl simply had no choice, or sooner or later, Linda would have gotten her way by completely kicking Cinnamon out of the house. In August 1985, Cinnamon was brought before the court. She also did not deny her guilt. Her father, David, was supposed to be the prosecution's witness in this case, but he missed the trial, citing illness. The trial lasted 5 days, and Cinnamon, then 15 years old, was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years imprisonment. She was then sent to Camarillo Juvenile Penitentiary in California. To those who saw her in prison, it seemed inconceivable that this serene child could commit such a crime. One investigator from the DAA's office, Jack Newell, felt the same way. He didn't think this girl could be a cold-blooded killer. The police sensed that something was wrong with the case, and even after the case was closed, he kept digging. Immediately after the Cinnamon trial, her father received an insurance payment of $835,000. Because it turns out, Linda's life was insured by 4 insurance companies. 2 of the 4 insurance policies were issued a week before the girl's death. With this money, David purchased 2 new homes, as well as several cars. In the summer of 1986, David married 7 times. His wife was Patty Belly, the younger sister of his murdered wife. They tried to keep their marriage secret from others. They did manage to do it for a while, but soon Patty got pregnant and the truth about their relationship came out. These facts added even more suspicion to the story, and in 1988, 3 years after the murder, the detective decided to talk to Cinnamon again about what really happened that night. At first, Cinnamon said she no longer knew exactly what had happened, but when the detective told her that her father had been married to Patty for 2 years, the girl finally decided to tell the truth about the night tragedy that happened 3 years ago. Cinnamon revealed that a few weeks before the murder, her father, David, told her and Patty that Linda and one of her brothers were planning to kill him to get his money, and so he will soon have to leave his family and the city because he is worried about his life. Cinnamon told her father that she did not want him to leave. He replied that then they should beat Linda and kill her themselves. The girl was not ready for such a step, but for the next weeks, her father, being alone with her, constantly told her that if she loved him, she had to do it. He managed to convince Cinnamon that since she is a minor, the maximum punishment she will receive is a couple of sessions with a child psychologist. But to make her look repentant in the eyes of justice, David suggested that she fake suicide by writing a suicide note after the crime. He suggested that she shoot herself on the edge of the head, which he said would not hurt the girl. However, she refused. David then suggested to his daughter that he take several dozen pills, which he said were perfectly safe. Cinnamon agreed to take this step because she trusted her father completely, but the only thing she didn't know was that if she hadn't vomited in that booth, she wouldn't have lived to see the cops. Eventually, on the evening of March 19, 1985, David entered his daughter's room and said that this was to happen today, after which David did leave the house, leaving Patty a loaded pistol, which later passed it to Cinnamon. 14-year-old Cinnamon went up to her stepmother's room and shot her in the stomach. She was about to go down, but heard Linda begging for help. As a result, Cinnamon returned to her room and fired another shot into the body of a dying woman. Then she went downstairs and gave the gun to Patty, and then she went to the doghouse, where she heard 3 more shots fired in the house. It was probably the same shots that were later presented to the police as evidence of the Cinnamon attack on Patty. The girl squeezed the suicide note in her hands and took the pills her father gave her. Cinnamon's story seemed very logical, but her words alone were not enough to hold David and Patty accountable. Therefore, the detective suggested that Cinnamon wear a listening device and, during her father's next visit, try to get him to confirm what he said earlier. While visiting his daughter, David did make some self-incriminating remark. He asked his daughter to keep lying, otherwise everyone she knew would end up in jail, and there would be no one else to visit her. He also asked his wife to convince Cinnamon that Patty would switch places with him soon, but naturally, that was also a lie. Because David already knew something was up, and he was just stalling. When he finally stopped discussing the night with his daughter, he was arrested. In October 1988, in addition to David, Patty was also arrested and was quickly brought to light. She fully cooperated with the police and told the Brown family the whole story. Apparently, she moved into David and Linda's house when she was only 11, and almost right under Linda's nose, David cheated on her with her 11-year-old sister. In 1984, by the time Patty was living at David's house for 4 years, David started trying to convince her that they needed to get rid of Linda. But every time, Patty refused to kill her sister, so David manipulated his daughter into killing Linda. Moreover, on the night of the murder, he drugged his daughter to give her confidence in crime. After his arrest, David realized that his affairs were really bad, and already in prison, a shocking plan was born in his head. While awaiting trial, David became very close to a prisoner named Jones, who was just days away from being released. David offered him $10,000 for Jones to kill a detective on David's case after his release. Another $10,000 for Jones to find a woman who commits a felony to go to the prison where Patty is and kill her there. Jones agreed, and David was confident that he would get away with it. But what he didn't know was that Jones was an undercover cop, and in the end, David, to the charges he already has, was charged with 2 more counts of attempted murder. The trial took place in April 1990. Both girls, Cinnamon and Patty, testified against David. The judge called David a scary man and added that even he was afraid of him. In June 1990, David Brown was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. David's wife was sentenced to 4 years in prison. As a result of the review of the Cinnamon case, the girl spent only 7 of the 27 years in prison to which she was originally sentenced. She was released in 1992 at the age of 21. After that, she had no problem with the law, but another tragedy occurred in her life, the suicide of her first husband. According to the latest data, she married a local police officer in 2004 and is currently married to him. Patty was released at the age of 25, and after her release, she married a guard who worked at the same prison where she was serving her sentence. David Brown spent 24 years in prison and died in 2014 at the age of 61. Linda and David's daughter, Crystal, was raised by David Brown's mother. Crystal was told that her mother died in a car accident. The truth came out when she was about 13. After she grew up, she tried to find her Aunt Patty and sister Cinnamon by writing on Facebook once. "I need to make peace with them. I don't blame any of them for what happened. I'd like to meet my sisters. Patty and Cinnamon, if you keep your eye on the page, I hope you too see that. Know that no matter what happens, I love you no matter what you did back then. What matters is that you and everyone else know that you are forgiven, and I look forward to meeting you and meeting your families. With love to all of you." Crystal even started her YouTube channel, where she posted videos in memory of her mother. And I also recorded videos of questions about her mother's murder. The girl was probably able to make contact with Patty because another post appeared later on the Crystal page. I think it's time I told you something. Some time ago, I finally met Patty face to face. I'll tell you the truth, I couldn't cry. It wasn't a lack of emotion. It's because I made my peace long ago and forgave her long before I even spoke to her. I've never been an emotional person. Even my husband has seen me cry 1 or 2 times for 15 years together. I'll tell you, she did cry a lot, and I knew she had to let it all out. All I could do was hug her and tell her everything was fine. I completely forgive her, and I don't blame her. I plan to spend more time with her and get to know her better. After all, we have something to catch up on. I have to tell you all that the woman some of you hate doesn't exist. What you've heard, read and seen on TV, it's not about the man I've met. Remember, this tragedy happened more than 30 years ago. I know that it has changed a lot since then, and I can only imagine the pain and heartache and torment she's been through. People change a lot in 30 years, and she's ready for a new beginning.